So good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to see some of you and all of you actually for such a long time. It's good to be back to IGBO. Thank you, Asia, for inviting us to present, and really appreciate that. And so in the next few minutes, I will update the group about the development of Stato. So yes, thank you, Asia, for the next slide. So the scope of Stato was essentially to cover statistical tests initially, but also the conditional applications, the probability distributions, variables, all the kind of metrics that were needed to run a test. But also we wanted to cover some aspect or relate Stato to notions of experimental design and connect some of the plots and graphical representation that were commonly used to somehow present results. So that was in a way the initial scope, and I will show you how this came about. But this is next slide, please. Coming on top of work that we did in collaboration with the Global Foundry. So if you want to access Stato, everything is open source on GitHub. You have the link included, but also you can browse the resource from the various ontology browsers that you are all familiar with. So whether it is in Europe at EMBL-EBI with the ontology lookup service, or ontobby provided by Oliver Hay Group, or other resources, obviously directly from the Global Foundry as well. And of course, because it's like also on GitHub, we lift the infrastructure for a lot of the project management and daily action, so logging issues and discussions and stuff like that. So what you can see from the name of the GitHub repo is that it's in connection with another project that is running our group, which is the investigation study assay standard format that we use for managing multi-omic studies. And really, this is what was somehow for us, for the needs that we were faced with our users, in a way, instigated the development of Stato, because we had a need for annotating the results of the analytical work, and it was not really necessarily the coverage at that time. I will go back to that point so a bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So as I indicated, the Stato has been submitted to the Global Foundry, where it seems to be quite popular. And even though we don't have a formal publication manuscript that we can cite, there are a number of resources that are actually using Stato at the moment, and this is really encouraging. Even though, as you will see in the last part of the presentation, it's been kind of hard to get funded and funding and support for developing those resources. Next slide, please. So really, as I indicated, and the reason why we are presenting at IGBO, like a lot of the mechanics and the methodology that has been used to develop Stato is really anchored in the Global Foundry principles. And then this is meaning that since the inception of the Global Foundry and when we were working with a group and defining those principles, we tried, as we developed Stato, to apply them as much as we can, which means that Stato is BFO imported based. It also relies or connects really well with the ontologies such as the ontology of biomedical investigations, but also the information artifact ontology, since we were involved in the development as well. When it comes to the global principle, I think one aspect that we focused on is the documentation of the resource as much as possible. We wanted to have as extensive documentation as possible for within the resource itself. So that's why we have textual definition and axiomatic definition for most of the classes, as well as example of usage. And this includes pointer to a publication, a PubMed ID usually, but also documentation pointing to R or Python packages that are used, because the two languages are quite popular. And I think it was a nice way for having that demonstration that every class included in Stato is anchored into reality, and there is a need for that. But of course, tracking contribution to the resource by tracking editors and contributors to the project through their IDs whenever possible. Next slide, please. This just to give you an example of the kind of metadata annotation we have for most of the classes. This is an example, typical class of in Stato. Here we're showing the archaic information criteria, but you can see the definition is extensive. We identify the sources. And again, this is really out of the box from the practice that has been developed by other resources like OB or IAO at the very beginning again. So here we've tried to be good citizens and show by examples of how this can be done. As you can see, we have specific metadata like the R command as well, or the state of alternative term that allows also to specify specific resources as I indicated. Also, in the second lower box, you can see the formal, or at least some of the axioms that are associated to that class. In some cases, they are much more advanced. We don't have time to build really into this today, but in a way, we try to, whenever possible, to constrain, especially on the statistical test, for instance, what are the conditional applications, what are the typical inputs and outputs in terms of distribution, or what kind of p-value and confidence interval, and so on. Next slide, please. When it comes to the development and the maintenance of it, a big shout out to robot.jar. I think we do the robot tool essentially developed by James Overton and colleagues and Becky Jackson. I think this has been really helping us maintain feeding all the classes, maintaining the template, which is basically a big spreadsheet where we can organize the knowledge and the definitions, and as well as push that to the GitHub repository and run the tool to get the new class or the new annotation automatically generated, as well as manage the imports and the reasoning and the classification of the class. So they really, in combination with Protege, as you can see before, we're showing the screenshot of the class. These are the kind of two tools at the moment we are using, in addition to GitHub, of course, as I indicated. So next slide, please. So still on the aspect of documentation, I think what we developed was a collection of query cases to showcase how Stato could be used as well as a form of didactic resources. And in a way, we had a number of queries for what are the conditional application of statistical tests, or when some tests could, or what some of the statistical tests are good for. And I give you an example here for, if you have a longitudinal study or repeated measure design, for instance, and you want to look at the variation within subject, there are a number of tests that you can apply, and this is the question. If you ask Stato, DL will allow you to answer that question and at least retrieve the three assays that the three tests that we have are currently coded in that way. And there are other examples of this. You can go to the GitHub website and a dedicated site that actually shows these queries. Next slide, please. And we also have, for instance, a number of definitions of statistical plots, which are used to present a number of statistical results, or that are mostly used in typical contexts. For instance, the case of the meta-analysis, you've got a number of the three plots, the forest plot, the Galbraith plot, and the funnel plot, which are actually used to present the result of this meta-analysis and how the different contributing data sets are in a way contributing to the result. And these are the definitions that are displayed from our web application that was developed by Aaron Group. We've got, if you want to go and consult, a number of other such cases. And this was in terms of documentation, as I said, this is an important aspect when you develop ontology, to be sure that we have a clear idea of why we are developing this. And this allowed us to somehow validate some of the ideas that we wanted to showcase with the ontology. And maybe that would be also something people will find useful, either for teaching or for testing themselves, or for reviewing or checking the quality of the resource itself, self-assessment. Next slide, please. As I indicated at the beginning of the presentation, in a way, really the reason why that drove the development of Stato was the support of another project, which is the reporting of study design experiments, or multi-omic experiments, where people are in the wet lab describing the experiments, but they have to submit to public repositories. And the ISA format was supporting just the the description of the experimental metadata, but the format stops at where the data matrices start. When the people are reporting, for instance, the result of a gene set enrichment analysis or a differential analysis, there is no particular specification for describing how the matrices should be described or should look like. And if we look at the transition from, moving away from the lab notebooks and structuring information in more and more fair ways, I think the spreadsheet was a compromise in a way, meaningful for human, easy to interact with. But for machines, we need basically graphs and all the facts somehow structured in RDF, as the previous speaker was actually introducing as well, which was really nice. So next slide, please. So as I indicated, the ISA project mentioned really focused on the workflow of what happens in the wet lab, mostly. This is the main focus of the format. It's supported by now Python API that supports this, but we still had this gap, and this is what we wanted to somehow, with Sato, provide a vocabulary that could help clarify some of the headers that were usually provided or generated by a number of R components or workflow analysis, analytical workflows which are documented, but for which sometimes the data matrices that are the result of those executions are not fully documented. Next slide, please. So now I will dive a bit deeper into some of the application of Stato that we our colleagues have done. I will start with a paper that we worked with Susanna Sansone in our group a couple of years ago, which was really an example of basically how do we transform a big ETL or small ETL on the data matrix for a GCMS profile in metabolomics. So we really detail the decomposition of the verification process that we took with a basic example, or at a time where we are still collaborating with people from EMBL EBI Metabolites, for instance, which is the repository for a metabolomic signal archive in Europe. Next slide, please. So with this slide, it essentially takes really something that you find usually in many papers. It's a supplementary material. It's an Excel table. And we can see that with this table are a number of problems related to the notion of making the data more reusable and findable and everything the FAIR principles are about. The first thing was the fact that this supplementary file was only available from the Nature website. And so we first did a motion to move it to submit it to Zenodo to get a DOI. So we have a stable identifier for that resource, and then perform the transformation, which is basically an ETL. And so here we have two-stage ETL. One is the transformation of that Excel file into a frictionless data file or data matrix, where the transformation is kind of transformation of that table, which involves a melt essentially, where we had a long table where each of the field is completely specified and marked up with a term in Stato. The RDF type can be identified. The weakness of the frictionless is that it doesn't necessarily allow you to specify the relationship between the tables, and this is between each of the field of the table. But it was already a first step at improving the fairness, if we look at the maturity of the verification process. So now the next step, obviously, from the frictionless table and the annotation that we had was to move to a full RDF linked data graph, which we also performed. And this is a step of somehow semantic modeling. Stato played a role here in identifying or allowing to specify more unambiguously the notion of standard error or mean or average that was supplied, but also identify the independent variables and the response variables, and as well as the treatment group and the sample sizes that were used for each of these groups, which was an interesting aspect. And that was further validated by the processing of another data set from the same group, but they're on different experiment on the same topic, and which allowed us to somehow mobilize this information and query it through Sparkle query and integrate the data to some extent. So that was the first case for use of Stato. Next slide, please. And more recently, in 2020, our collaborators at the University of Birmingham, Ralph Weber, who was leading into the analytical work on MS, LCMS, and metabolite profiling by MS data at the National Phenome Center in Birmingham, developed an R package, Struct, where basically they started integrating some of the Stato terms for describing the methods, and that means that not only the data output is annotated properly with the relevant types, but also some of the elements in the workflow and the code are also themselves marked up, which in a way is an interesting development as well, and something we would like to see refine or develop further. Next slide, please. And another case that I wanted to mention to introduce the group as well is the collaboration that we had with colleagues in plant science and the analytical phenotyping group in Poland at so Anna Szwiak-Kopinska and Paweł Krajewski have been really spearheading the extension of Stato by working on this linear mixed model within the framework of the ontology, and I'll try to see to show you how the different components that have been added here in the next few slides. But essentially, the context of this work was the fact that people were using high-throughput phenotyping in plant for characterizing the different cultivars and the selection process of these plants. And here, got very large number of variables that are correlated to both the genetic variation. And this is, there are a number of methodologies which were well established in the literature, but could not be described clearly. And this has been most of the work been done to identify the different contexts, concepts or notions and types, and then include them into Stato. Next slide, please. So this is taken from this is a picture taken from the scientific data article, but as you can see, there is this anchoring, top-level anchoring to BFO, IO, and OB, where we distinguish between the plant specification and the data transformation. And then we had to identify a different step in data transformation, like model fitting, model parameter estimation, and the statistical test itself, as well as the definition of, or the description of the statistical model and how the different variables are somehow mixed together into the model with the different terms of the model, and how this is then fed or consumed by the model fitting transformation. So we had to undergo these elements and find new relations, like estimator R, for instance. Also at the same time, we wanted to remain compatible as much as we could with the framework. So that was also setting a constraint on our development. Next slide, please. So I apologize for the small, the overloaded picture probably, but again, these are two figures, and I encourage you to go back to the publication. But these are essentially concept maps that we've developed and worked on with our colleagues to somehow see how far we could work with the ontological framework. And to describe the key steps or the key elements that should be reported when people are talking about a linear mixed model. And this comes, so we've got the key elements, like we need to identify the fixed effect term, the random interaction term, and the error term, and as well as identifying the estimation methods that are used for computing some of these elements. And of course, a different software will implement the algorithms in different ways, and they might be more efficient than others. And But still, it's important to be able, when you compare, when people are reporting the results of those analytical work, to understand which models were used and which software were actually applied, as well as understand the kind of relations that were, all the assumptions that were made between the different variables for understanding the validity of the results. I think the, we can go to the next slide, please. In terms of, yes, thank you for extending the screen, scrolling down a little bit. I think these are, again, the view or what was done in that work, especially in the space of the model parameter estimation and being able to identify the different methods that were used and are commonly used, but also in a way, still in the way the model fitting are done and the way these results are reported. Not only is it important to mention the p-value, but also if they are, what is the confidence interval, as well as the different cutoff that were applied. So it's not only the issue of mentioning simply the p-value, but we understand the provenance of this p-value and its context. And this includes also, obviously, the multiple testing corrections. These components were already covered by OB and the data transformation component, but I think that's also an aspect that would live in a way naturally into the scope of an ontology covering statistics. Next slide, please. So in the last part of the presentation, I think I would like to mention a more recent development collaboration that we have with the COVID Knowledge Acceleration Group, COCA working group with a FIRE working group. This is led by Dr. Brian Alper, who also leads the computational publishing. And here, the group actually reviewed a number of artifacts, semantic artifacts, which were operating in the field of statistics. So there were a number of resources, and they selected Stato at a time because of the coverage, and that was the one that was providing the result that was providing most of their needs, but they also identified areas where things could be improved. And so over the last 2 years, we've been working on reviewing a number of definitions, but also reviewing the hierarchy and the anchoring of the various classes in Stato. This is ongoing work. As you can see, there are also new needs, and the platform has actually several components. One of them is the risk of bias, but it's connected to the notion of study design and the notion of statistical metrics, or all these elements that are important to the reporting of science. So I think this is really a very helpful exercise to check the content and the sanity of the results and improving over the existing content. Next slide, please. So just to give you an example of how these classes are actually viewed in the Fever platform. This is a platform that is developed by the computational publishing that allows you to edit the information and track the metadata for who has contributed to the voting as well. But there is a difference. It's not an ontology per se that is developed. It is a hierarchical vocabulary, but there is no axiomatic definition of the types. So we still need to review or to integrate to these to retrofit in Stato some of the new upgraded definitions that are coming from the work that we do with the COCA working group. Next slide, please. And this is in a way where we need to reform the way the information, the release process of Stato is going. We need to be able to parse the JSON coming from Fiverr. I'm currently doing that with already 2 API because I need to get the JSON from that interface and then retrofit that into the hierarchy. So it's a bit complicated. And also the work that needs to be done is to see what kind of axioms can be placed as well, while retaining the credit and all this information in the ontology. Next slide, please. Also, what we've explored is the internationalization of the resource. We've been establishing collaboration for translation to Stato French with the University of Paris 8, Professor Jean-Marc Monnier, but also translation to Spanish that was the task Alejandra in our team before she left initiated. And here we were in a slight glitch in a way with the having to deal with multiple definitions in AL, well, in the AL of Stato, which actually, even though they were qualified by a language tag, raises an error in the ontology QC pipeline. And this is something that we may want to discuss further or just try to address at some point. Next slide, please. So in the future work, obviously, as I indicated, we'd like to move possibly to the ODK, the Ontology Development Kit, and really streamline the build process. Using GitHub Action would be ideal, obviously, but that's something that we will try to fix this year. And also, we would like to expand, obviously, to extend the coverage of Stato as much as we can to other areas or other domains as we go about. So this is something that we've been working with collaborators at University of Michigan, and hopefully we will be able to refine this. And of course, ideally, it would be great to integrate Stato with more tools so that we ensure that article workflow create that are matrices that are generally fair and already annotated, no more free text, and as much as markup is made natively, so we have something like this fair by design. Next slide, please. So really, I'd like to acknowledge all these people because this is really a teamwork and a lot of people. So Dr. Sansane, Emma Maguire, Alexandra, and Ole in Oxford. I'd like to thank Asia for giving us the opportunity, James Overton for his patience and support with robots, Anna Schweck-Kupinska for the linear mixed model, Ralph for struct, and Brian Alper, Joan de Mastel, Harold Lehman, and the FIRE working group. Also, George Alter at the University of Michigan, and really grateful to all these people for their input. And I will take any question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, okay, please. Yeah. Yeah, so I invited Philip to present here because I was involved in this COCA group. Brian Alford, if anybody involved in FIRE, he's doing the computable knowledge stuff. And in the beginning, their group was evaluating over 100 overall ontologies because they want to describe the study results, including the study design from the literature. So I just somehow got to know them. And then I said, okay, if you're looking at statistics, you need to work with Stato. So I introduced Philip to them. And I think this is a good example to harmonize the different themes of the terminologies or ontologies together by defining terms at the beginning and trying to use, for example, they were defining all those Stato terminologies and they included the COCA system, but then they were not going to, they say we cannot maintain this. So they pass those to Stato. Stato has a good use case to create some new terms, and then Stato can be more ontological, representation than COCA. So that's why I invited them. But who has a question? Is there anybody online has a question? We will. Yeah, we have like 3 minutes. I'm so sorry for. Oh, okay. John has one.
I already have a mic. That's Kathy. So I presumably, or well, first let me say, fantastic. I'm a big fan. It's great. Second, presumably the definitions that are causing 2 tiers and the are those definitions, although they're translated in different languages, they're the same, roughly speaking. Is that right?
You asking?
Yeah, I'm asking you, Philip. Are they the same, those definitions in Spanish, in English, in French?
Yes, well, they are so this is where it becomes difficult. I think the question was whether the definition were exactly the same between the different languages. And so it's not so, sometimes it's very straightforward, but other cases are just we need definitely the input of statisticians in a native language somewhere else to really ensure that the elements are clarified. Usually the only true definition is the mathematical one. If we have the formula and the element, the pointer, then we manage to clarify things.
So even those that are exactly the same are still causing QC errors?
Sorry, I can't hear very well. So
those that are exactly the same, are they still causing QC errors?
Well, I think it's just the presence of more than one definition. It's purely syntactic. It's not, there is no check on the validity of the translation. It's simply the presence of more than one definition in the OWL file for a given type that somebody is picked up rightfully so by the QC pipeline at the moment. It's really minor. It's just that I think the difference, if it could be checked that the language tag is in a way distinct, then we would have possibly the ability to have that information. Or maybe there are better ways to do internationalization with the stuff that I'm not aware of, and that's possibly entirely true.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The reason I'm pressing on this is that I'm hoping somebody in the room would just take the mic from me and answer like, what should we do next? How do we get around the QC problem that's blocking code?
We have to talk to upstairs.
So this is Gary. I wanted to make one quick comment on the vocabulary. We've run into this issue. What we see is that there are multiple takes on a concept. Sometimes it's a concept being described as an object with a label that's the same for a process. And so what we have found is that we have to maintain semantic analysis on the terminologies for people to understand. So it's another example of linking a semantic analysis of vocabularies, and then linking it to the ontology. So people might see one particular definition and then notes the alternatives. It sort of implies you need subsequent semantic analysis to sort of distinguish these, and maybe subtyping and things of different roles and things of that nature. So it's important sort of as a note along the way for conceptualization. I see that Anu has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. This is Anu. Hey, Philippe.
Hi, Anu.
I had two quick questions. So both, I guess, relating in some way to the FHIR-COCA work. I know that Brian's team is actually implementing FHIR for clinicaltrials.gov. And I was wondering if you know if they've used Stata or Stat ontology within that framework.
Well, so my understanding is that Brian is overlooking the SEFCO development, and SEFCO has several components. So one is, as I think I mentioned, was the risk of bias, which is, so there are 5 working groups somehow, and they are running different days of the week, and we try to coordinate this information. But my understanding is indeed the terms that are existing in Stato are included into their nomenclature. They are imported, and I think I was showing the screenshot of the tool. You can see that the Stato identifier is present. When there are new needs, transient identifier is minted, and until we stabilize the definition and we can meet an official ones. So what we are working out now is a kind of operational production ready system where they would reuse, if they found a term that is in scope for Stato, they would submit to Stato, and I would have to somehow integrate it. But then the definition, the information would be exported and maintained as well into the SEFCO system.
I see. Thank you. And by the way, great presentation. My other quick question is, have you contacted any repositories so that you could kind of include the, ontology in the initial phase when data gets submitted into repositories?
Yes, very good question. Thank you, Anu. So yes, we are in touch. I'm in touch mostly with Metabolites repository in the EU, and this is also, we have been working with the Galaxy's workflow, especially on metabolomics, try to annotate a number of workflows. This is in a way an extra burden on the developer of those resources. So it's, and also I have to say that this work on Stato is a bit of a side project for me, and it's been kind of hard to get funding for developing the resource, and this is also a big impediment, I guess. But ideally, yes, I would agree. And making these, and this is the effort that we try to look at to integrate that with software tools so that the results are themselves marked up.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea, you know, just to have that kind of markup at the result phase, which then gets pushed into repositories for, you know, data sharing, right?